Just as Christians will use certain places in the Hebrew Bible, like Psalm 22, Isaiah chapter 53, the suffering servant, as proof text that Jesus was crucified,
we don't have to use proof text from the Old Testament to argue Jesus was crucified. It's an historical fact that he died by crucifixion. Numerous early sources confirm Jesus died by crucifixion, including secular sources.
the Muslims will say that this idea that Jesus wasn't crucified is actually more in line with pre-Christian messianic Jewish expectations. Like David writes in the Psalms, it's very explicit. Psalm 20, verse 6. I know that God, the Lord, saves his Messiah.
Psalm 20 doesn't say that God is going to save the Messiah from death unless you read that into the passage. First off, the word is just anointed. Numerous men in the Hebrew Bible, both priests and kings, are called God's anointed. It's only at a much later time point that being called the Anointed One specifically refers to the Messiah. Psalm 20 is also a David psalm, so it's probably just referring to King David, who was also called God's Anointed. The context suggests this. Also, biblical Hebrew doesn't have future or past tense, only perfect and imperfect tense. The verb save is imperfect tense, suggesting it should be translated in the present or in past tense. So this is not talking about something that will happen in the future. Robert Alter suggests the context shows it was a military threat that King David had to face, given it talks about chariots and horses. Basically, this verse is not a messianic prophecy unless you read that into the passage.
For 1,300 years, the only scripture that made this claim was the Quran. The only religious tradition that made this claim that Jesus wasn't crucified were the Muslims.
No, we can find this claim in Gnostic religious traditions, which started sprouting up in the 2nd century AD. And some of these groups existed well into the Middle Ages, which means they would have been existing alongside Muslims.
But in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, they discovered Christian treatises and gospels and apocalypses, like the second treatise of the Great Seth, the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of John was later discovered, that actually state that there were indeed Christian denominations before the advent of the Prophet Muhammad that denied the crucifixion.
And we knew about them before 1945 because church fathers like Irenaeus mentioned them. And we know why these later heretical groups denied the crucifixion. They had a theological commitment to Jesus being only divine, not human, so he couldn't suffer as a human would. But because the crucifixion was so central to the story of Jesus, these Gnostic groups had to still account for it. So they came up with convoluted stories like Jesus being replaced with a substitute to explain why so many people believe that Jesus was crucified. And this is why historians today don't take seriously the idea that Jesus wasn't crucified. It doesn't start showing up until the 2nd century, and we know it was theologically motivated. Moreover, some historians have speculated that this Gnostic idea is what led to the Islamic belief that Jesus wasn't crucified.